Hey everyone, Matt Brunig here. On the heels of my last video where I responded to the debate between Destiny and Richard Wolff, I wanted to do a video, a kind of positive video of my vision of socialism, or at least my vision about how best to explain socialism and get across what we're talking about when we're talking about socialist modes of organization and stuff like that. At least my own perspective on it. Obviously, these things differ somewhat. And the main reason I'm kind of interested in doing that after watching that debate is because, in it, Richard Wolff, his approach to trying to describe socialism is very historical. And this is very common with a lot of people, especially people who are real into Marx and stuff. They like to kind of give this history of the world, the same one that Marx gave in his writings, where we go through a series of economic systems, starting with these primitive hunter-gatherer societies, which you could call primitive communism. That's what Marx calls it, at least. Then we get into these feudal systems where you have lords who are on the top and you have serfs who are on the bottom, and the serfs work for the lords and the lords kind of exploit them in the process. And this is all kind of mediated through land ownership institutions and things of that sort. Then from there, or maybe not exactly from there, but around the same time, we get these slave societies where you've got masters and slaves, and in that process, of course, the masters are taking from the slaves, but there they directly own the serf, they directly own the slave, or the worker in this case, so it's different from the lord and the serf. The lord doesn't own the serf, but he does own the land, and the serf belongs to the land, and whatever, it's sort of a different system. And then we get this capitalist system. It's what comes next, where you have employees and employers, and the employees are in this kind of free labor regime. So they're not owned by the lord through the land, nor are they owned by a master directly as a slave. They're selling their labor in a labor market, but they're still on the bottom, and they're still not in the power position that the owners in the system are, because lacking their own capital, they have no choice but to try to get a wage in the market and blah, 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 right? And that's the kind of story he wants to tell. And I think it's useful to talk about that. I think, if nothing else, getting people's eyes open to the fact that, the way that we're organizing our economy now and the society now, that's not how it was always organized. And so that also implies that it might not be the way that it always will be organized, right? There's an inevitabilism that you can run into if you're not exposed to the fact that there are different ways of doing things, and that there have been different ways of doing things. But with that all said, my mind works more in the realm of abstraction. I'm not so keen on historical narratives to kind of get you going and get you thinking about things. So you could say, you can understand capitalism by comparing it to feudalism and comparing it to slavery and and telling this historical. That's not really where I like to go. I like to start conceptually. Let's start with like a simple concept, and then I can walk you through more concepts starting from that concept. And at the end of the process of evolving these concepts, hopefully socialism gets illuminated and you know what we're talking about. That's how I like to do it. So in this video, and this is an idea I've had for a while, but I've never executed on it in writing or in any other form, I want to kind of tell the story. Maybe story is the wrong word. I want to explain socialism using corporate governance flow charts. So I don't know if it's been done before. I'm sure it has, but I've never seen it done. But it's something that rattles around in my head a lot. So let's just hop into that. So for starters, I think it's useful to make this distinction, which I talked about briefly in my prior video. I wrote this piece in 2018, 5 years now, titled Identifying Socialist Institutions and Socialist Countries. So I was having this debate back and forth with a few people, Neil Meyer, Matthew Dessin, Michael McCarthy, in which I was trying to basically defend the position that the Nordic societies are quite socialistic, and we kept going back and forth and getting tripped up about, well, are they or aren't they, or is state ownership the same thing as socialism, and what about blah 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 blah. At the end of this debate, we ended up in a similar place where I feel like they kind of conceded that, yeah, okay, Matt, you make a good point about them being quite socialistic, but I would like them to be even more socialistic. And then I'm like, okay, cool, me too. But like, as long as you agree with that first point, we're making progress here. So I want to describe it this way. My argument is that Nordic countries, Norway in particular, Finland after them, Sweden in the mid-century, have put together very effective socialist institutions. I use that phrase to refer to institutions that facilitate the collective democratic ownership of capital. In Nordic institutions, in Nordic countries, those institutions are, number one, a general government sector that provides public services like education and childcare, a portfolio of state-owned enterprises, and social wealth funds that own other capital assets. And then I go on to explain a lot of the muddling that happens is that we have this definitional problem that arises when you go from identifying an institution as socialist, a particular productive unit in the society as socialist, or as being organized along socialist principles. The problem arises when you go from a specific productive unit to trying to talk about whether a whole country is socialist or whether a whole economy is socialist, right? And as I keep going, if you define countries in a binary way as socialist or non-socialist, then a socialist country is one where the size of the socialist institution must pass some kind of threshold, I suppose. But drawing that line is very tricky. So one way to think about this is, let's imagine you have whatever you think a fully blown socialist society is, a socialist economy, okay? Now someone goes out there and they open up a lemonade stand. That's an example people like to use a lot. So they just go out onto the street and they start selling lemonade somehow. Well, that's not being organized socialistically, presumably, in the way that you want it done. So does that mean now the economy is not socialist anymore? Like 99.99999% of the economy is organized socialistically, but this one unit isn't. So do we go, not socialist anymore? I think people would find that a little strange. On the flip side, if you had a full-blown capitalist society, whatever that means to you, and someone went out and did something socialistic, they organized some kind of commune in it or whatever, would you then say that country is socialist? No, probably not. Okay, so we know that it's not like a one-drop rule in either direction. So then what is it? Is it 50%? Is it 60%? Is it 70%? I don't, we want to be able to attach a binary label when in fact this is kind of a continuous thing. We can attach a binary label more or less to a specific institution and say that's a socialist institution, that's a socialist company, that's a socialist firm. But it's very hard to then attach that to the economy, which is just the abstract concept we use to describe the aggregation of like millions of productive entities, some of which are socialistly organized and some of which are capitalistically organized. You see what I'm saying? It's a spectrum, not a binary. Anyways, I kind of joke around in here. So like, Brad DeLong, famous economist, I've talked to him about this before, and he tells me that a socialist country is one where socialist institutions have to be accountable for 60% of GDP. As I point out here in Norway, the number is 60% of GDP, which is quite close. Lane Kenworthy had a similar conundrum. So he wrote this book last year, Would Democratic Socialism Be Better? This is a good book. I hate to offer it to people who are anti-socialist because, it gives them so much ammunition. But I like Lane. We email back and forth. He actually sent me this book, emailed it to me before it went out. So we get along really well. He's another one of those guys who loves the Nordic countries, but he has a slightly different take on them than I do. But he's a very honest guy, and he produces extremely good work. Anyways, he wrote this book, and he wants to argue that social democratic capitalism is better than democratic socialism, and he wants to use the Nordic societies to prove this point. So this becomes a major point of contention I've had with Lane sort of over the years, is I want to nudge Lane a little bit and say, hey, Lane, you're talking about these countries' welfare states, and that's great. You're talking about their unions, and that's great, but you're not talking a lot about their state ownership. And I kind of feel like you're missing a little something there, because that's a socialist edge to these countries that I think is significant in the way that they operate and whatever. But he wants to get Nordics in kind of like the capitalist bucket, so then he can say, oh, we just want social democratic capitalism. I want to get them more in the socialist bucket, at least to acknowledge that they are the most socialistic of the sort of developed countries, and that's a sort of part of the conflict. But if he's going to write a whole book about this, 277 pages we see here, he's got to come up with some way to distinguish, like, what is socialism? How do I say that, one is better than the other without first defining each of them? And he does this here, right, on page 11. What might democratic socialism look like? And he says, blah, 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 blah. The core distinguishing features of contemporary democratic socialist ideas are public ownership of firms and economic democracy. And he doesn't quite say that he thinks this is the line, but he uses this fraction a lot, 2/3. So it seems as if he's kind of saying, look, if you have 2/3 or more of your economy in government hands, then that counts. And I think he's talking about 2/3 of employment, because that's then what he keeps going back to. So I guess, if 67% of the workers of the country are employed in socialist institutions, which he includes any kind of public ownership or worker ownership or whatever. If 67% of the employees are employed that way in your economy, then you tip over into socialism. 66%, no, it's capitalism, but 67% you get over the line. Anyways, I point this out just to kind of show you the silliness of the line drawing in trying to figure out what's a socialist country versus a capitalist country. Once you understand that you can organize socialist units within an economy, and they can either be more socialistic or less socialistic, you end up having to draw these binary lines that are quite arbitrary. Even in this one, he says 2/3 of the economy, and then he shifts to employment. Norway, is going to be something like 45 to 50%, depending on exactly how you count their state-owned enterprises, are going to be employed in government, like public ownership. So even there, they're not quite to 2/3, but like they're a lot closer than you might imagine. So I don't know, give them some credit. Anyways, let's put that all behind us, and let's get to the topic of the day. If I want to say, let's talk about socialism on the institutional level, on the level of a productive unit, then let's talk about different ways of organizing productive units and think about this from like a corporate governance perspective, okay? So I'm going to walk you through 10 different ways to sort of organize a productive apparatus that I think can help illuminate a lot of these ideas, okay? So let's start with number 1, subsistence. This is the simplest form of economic organization. You just have a worker. And this is, imagine like a worker just out in the wilderness. It's just one guy on his own. He's out in the wilderness. He produces all this stuff solely for his own consumption, right? So a lot of the examples of this that you'll see kind of in fiction are people who wash up on islands, right? So someone gets marooned on an island all by themselves. What was the movie with Tom Hanks? Castaway, like that, right? He was on the island and he was very productive because he had to feed himself and build all this stuff and whatever. And he would produce. He was sort of the owner of the productive apparatus, if you want to talk about it like that. He had no other people around him. He didn't have to share with anything. He also didn't have any consumers. Like, he would produce things, but he wouldn't sell them to anyone. He wouldn't give them to anyone. He would produce them and then he would consume them. So it's all contained in one entity right now. The production, the consumption, the ownership, the management, the return, the output, the distribution. It's all contained in one guy. That is like subsistence, the easiest, most simplest form you can get. Of course, that has basically never existed except in like bizarre cases where you have like a hermit goes out into the woods, or I guess, theoretically a castaway or something like that. But it's conceptually possible and it has occurred. Okay. All right. So what comes after subsistence? So after subsistence, I'm going to bring in the concept of a commune, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to add an S to worker. Okay, so communes, which are sometimes called intentional communities, sometimes called utopian communities. Marx would have called what I'm talking about here primitive communism. Charles Fourier was one of the big advocates of this, one of the pre-Marx socialists. But the idea of a commune is to kind of, again, start with the idea of subsistence. You have one worker, and he produces and consumes all on his own. But now just bring in multiple workers, and they kind of do it all together, right? So a hunter-gatherer tribe is an obvious kind of version of this, right? They produce within their unit, and some of what you produce may be consumed by someone else in the tribe or the commune or the intentional community or whatever, and something they produce might be consumed by you. But that's all kind of happening collectively through a kind of common ownership system, right? And in a more kind of ideologically left commune, of course, everyone in the commune will sit down and have meetings, and they'll vote on what we want to do and how we want to allocate the chores and who's going to do what kind of work and who's going to consume what and like all that kind of stuff. But it's kind of the idea of the lone worker subsisting, but now there's multiple workers subsisting. But other than that, nothing really changes, right? We don't have any outside consumers or customers, right? Nothing's being sold. Though I will say in practice, of course, modern communes, they try to do a lot of things on a subsistence basis, right? They try to produce as much of their consumption as they can, like in-house. But in practice, unless they want to kind of be very primitive, you can kind of think of like an Amish, though even they don't go this route. They do end up needing to produce a little bit for outside consumers so that they can get cash in and buy the stuff that they can't produce themselves. But in the world of concepts, you can think about a commune as being like a farm you go off on. We grow our own food, we chop down our own trees, we build our own houses, and we live together and we just consume what we produce. No outside owners, no managers exactly like we manage together, no outside consumers, so we're not dealing with the consumer market. It's a step up from it's subsistence with multiple actors in it. But other than that, it's just kind of subsistence, okay? Good. All right. So you get the idea of a commune. Very simple. So far, we're dealing with very few nodes. Okay. So now let's move into number 3, which I'm going to call sole proprietor / artisan. These are not quite like perfect terms because these terms can be used to mean other things as well, but that's what I'm going to go with. Okay. So with a sole proprietor or an artisan, we switch back to worker. So it's like one guy. You can think about, I don't know, a carpenter, right? Who, produces woodwork. And then what does he do with his woodwork? He sells it to a consumer, right? So now we've got our consumer for the first time. Before, the consumer and the worker was the same person. Right? In the subsistence and in the commune, the consumer and the worker was self-contained. In the commune, it was multiple workers, but it was still within the kind of body of workers. Now we've got an actual external consumer. So, of course, he makes stuff. The consumer pays him money, and that's how that all goes. Then he goes out, and in other contexts, he's the consumer, and he might buy stuff from other businesses or other sole proprietors or whatever, right? But in this case, the worker, I guess I should actually say we've got worker. At this point, I should say we have worker / owner, right? Yeah. Because the artisan owns his own little business. He might have like a single member LLC or something like that, right? So we've got the concept of an owner now, but he owns the business. He's the only worker in the business. So he keeps all the labor income from the business, all the money that comes from working, and he keeps all the profit from the business. In fact, the labor income and the profit income end up getting mixed together. In the national accounts, we would call it mixed income, or we would call it entrepreneurial income. But the profit share and the labor share all go to him. He's one guy. He owns, controls, does the whole thing. But what he's producing, he's selling to a consumer. All right, so that's that kind of organization. Now we're going to go another step up, okay? And we're going to call this an owner-operated business. Of course, again, like I say, these terms are not quite precise because is not a sole proprietor also engaging in an owner-operated business? But this is just a term I'm going to use here to try to make things a little bit clearer for me. Okay, so we've got the owner. But now the owner has, he has employees. So at this point, he's not just the worker owner. He's really like an executive because he's the boss. And these are the workers, right? All right. Now he does work in the business, right? Because we're going to say that he's both the owner and the executive. So let's say owner / executive. Let's bring the size down so it fits. Okay, he's the owner / executive. And I'm going to draw an arrow from him because he does do managerial labor in the production of goods. And he controls the worker, so I'm going to put an arrow there, right? Okay. So now we have this. Right? It's not just a worker owner who's like an artisan who has a direct relationship with consumers. He now runs a business where he employs workers. He's working as well as a manager, and he's the sole owner. So we don't have external owners yet. We don't have any external control or whatever. And this is the business that a lot of people like to think about, if not the prior one, the sole proprietorship. They like to think about these two kinds of businesses when we're talking about capitalism. In fact, if you ever read any conservative book that's sort of like an apologist, a defense of capitalism, if you will, those books will almost always proceed as if this is the only kind of business that exists, or that it's this one or the sole proprietorship. That's it, right? And what they like about this is that the owner and the executive, the owner and the boss, are the same person. So we get to confuse, or I should say mush together, their role as an owner that receives profits from the firm, profits that are being generated by the workers in part, with the role of an executive who is himself actually doing labor in the work. He is doing managerial labor, supervisory labor. He might be even doing some shop floor labor if it's like a small business as well. We get to kind of mix all that together, and therefore we don't get to talk about profit in a kind of pure sense because that profit's being mixed in with these legitimate, I won't say legitimate, these labor earnings, right? So again, we would end up calling that entrepreneurial income or mixed income in the national accounts, okay? So here we are. Now this is where we're going to start, this is where this is the first time the socialist critique, such as it is going to come in. The socialist critique is going to come in and say, all right, maybe not in every case, right? Because there's a bunch of firms, some of them lose money, whatever. But on average, we think that this owner and executive is skimming some of the profit off of the top of the workers, right? So the worker is going out and producing more revenue for the firm than they're getting to keep for themselves. And the surplus that's left is flowing up to this guy, right? So the consumer comes in, pays money into the company. Some of that goes to the worker in the form of wages. Some of it goes to the executive in the form of executive compensation for their managerial labor. But then there's a third portion of it that goes to the executive as profit, and we would say some of that profit is coming from the worker, and so there's like an exploitative element to that, right? Okay, so far so good. Now comes the cool stuff, all right? So far we've dealt with subsistence. We've dealt with the communes. We've dealt with the artisan who's a sole proprietor, and now we've dealt with this owner-operated business where, it's like a little small business and the CEO is also the sole owner of the company. But now we're going to move into the real stuff. What are we going to call this one? The joint stock company. This is one of the great innovations of the 19th century. It probably preceded the 19th century a little bit, but it really picks up in the 19th century. And Marx has something to say about this, which we will go into in a second. But what do we have here? Okay, so we keep this basic structure down here, right, with executives and workers. Here, I'll pump up the size a little bit. Okay. But we're going to bring in a board. And we're going to bring in shareholders. Let's draw the arrow. Whoops. All right. So in this case, you've now detached the top executive. Remember, in the prior case, the executive was the owner. The CEO was the owner. It's the same person. It's the same thing. He owns the whole thing. He gets the whole profit share and also does all the top managerial labor. When we bring in the joint stock company, now the shareholders are the owner. And what the shareholders do is they elect a board that acts on their behalf. The board elects executives, the CEO, but also other executives, right? The board appoints executives. And then the executives and the workers run the company, right? The executives are directly managing the workers. They're also making decisions. They are doing managerial labor. So I'm going to keep these arrows here because in my mind here, these arrows represent like they're both contributing to the production, right? They're actually every day getting up and working and doing stuff that helps produce the product that goes to the consumer. Now, in this system, this is a game-changing system because in the prior two systems versions where we had the artisan, the sole proprietor, right, and then we had the owner-occupied business, ownership income, the profit share of the firm, and managerial income is all mixed together. It's all mushed together. And this is actually, it's very helpful for people who want to kind of cloud the issue and kind of confuse the issue because it helps so much if we can imagine that the CEO's income is just income for their work. And if the CEO is also the owner, then we just say, wow, yeah, he does seem to have a really high income, but that's because his work is so valuable. But once we split the ownership off from the top manager and we say, no, these guys are now the owners, now we get a clean cut because these guys are getting profits from the firm. These guys get the profit share. The executive also gets paid, but he's getting paid for his labor. Now we can get into, well, maybe that's not quite the most accurate way to think about this because executives are kind of brought into the shareholder class at least a little bit and certainly through stock options and whatever. But conceptually here, right, I'm a man of concepts. The shareholders get the profits. The executive gets pay for executive labor. Right? And Marx sees this and he loves it. I would say this is what I think of when you're like, what is a capitalist organ? This is the paradigmatic capitalist organized firm, right? Because the capitalists are here, the shareholders. The executives are not even the capitalists per se, right? I mean, the executives might also own shares and this and that, but like, these are the capitalists, and they are pure capitalists. They're not, I own this and then I also do work. No, I just own. And I just sit and I wait, and every quarter I get money. I don't do anything. I just sit and I wait. I'm a pure money capitalist, right? So this is the first time we get that all split up. And you might think, well, Marx must hate this. Marx loves it. And I'll take you through why that is, and then from here, you'll get to see where we can go from here that gets us into socialism, okay? Okay. So this is from volume 3 of Capital. Did Marx write this? I don't know. Did Engels write this? I don't know. But it's in the book. It was published posthumously, of course, attributed to Marx. It seems legit that at least these were his thoughts. Whether they ended up, being edited in different ways, who knows? Okay. But let's start up here at the top. Okay. The capitalist mode of production has brought matters to a point where the work of supervision, entirely divorced from the ownership of capital, is always readily obtainable. It has therefore come to be useless for the capitalist to perform it himself. Right? So as I was just saying, the capitalist is now here, the manager is now here. So as Marx is saying, supervision, which is what the managers do, has now become entirely divorced from the ownership of capital, which is what the shareholders do. They're now literally just different people. And so the capitalist no longer has to perform managerial labor. We've completely split this off. And so managing production doesn't have to be an ownership thing. You could just hire professional managers. It can be basically an employee thing. Whereas before, if you're only thinking about sole proprietorships or these artisanal kind of businesses, you're always thinking like, well, if we didn't have private ownership, then how could we ever have a business? Because there would be no one to manage the companies. And he's like, no. The joint stock company has already shown us that this is not the case. We can divorce the ownership from the management. We can keep the people who are good at managing companies and just throw out these guys. They're not necessary. He continues here. The wages of management, both for the commercial and industrial manager, are completely isolated from the profits of enterprise in the cooperative factories of laborers, as well as in capitalist stock companies. So partially he's saying, hey, there are co-ops where they've already thrown these guys out. They've already thrown these guys out. And we'll get to co-ops in a second. We can look at examples of co-ops where you kind of got to this joint stock company arrangement and they just threw the shareholders overboard and made the workers the shareholders, but they still have a professional manager, right? But we don't need these guys. We don't need them. The co-ops prove that we don't need them. But also, the capitalist stock companies prove that we don't need them, because the capitalist stock companies, this joint stock company here, showed us that we can split them. We can split the pure owner from the pure manager. Not to be repetitive, but this is the key. The separation of wages of management from profits of enterprise, purely accidental at other times, is here constant. In a cooperative factory, the antagonistic nature of the labor of supervision disappears because the manager is paid by the laborers instead of representing capital counterposed to them. So he's talking about co-ops. He's saying, look, in a co-op system, the workers are the shareholders, so now the workers essentially employ the executives instead of the executives being employed by this external class of pure money capitalists who are shareholders. And that now we go full circle. The workers are both, the workers are both at the bottom of this doing all the work and at the top of this being the owners. And now the antagonism between the owner and the worker, where the owners want as much of the money from the company as they can get and the worker wants as much as the money of the money from the company as they can get, it disappears because the worker's now the owner. Very beautiful. Okay. Stock companies in general have an increasing tendency to separate this work of management as a function from the ownership of capital, be it self-owned or borrowed. So again, there's separation. Now I'll give you one more here from Marx. This is from chapter 27. The other one's chapter 23. This is like, these were unfinished manuscripts, right? In this part, no one even attempted to finish it. It's like fucking run-on sentences and shit, but it's fun to look at and you see what he's saying here, right? So he's talking about the formation of stock companies. He's talking about this structure. He loves this structure, okay? The formation of stock companies gives us an enormous expansion of the scale of production and of enterprises that was impossible for individual capitals. And at the same time, enterprises that were formerly government enterprises become public. Okay, so individual capitals, what is he talking about here? He's talking about those sole proprietorships that we just talked about, those artisanal businesses, or those small owner-operated businesses. He's saying, well, what's cool about these big old shareholder joint stock companies is that they could be big and they could do really big stuff. Whereas if you just had one guy who was the owner-operator of a business, how big you can make that business it's hard to get that stuff really big, right? Okay, fine, whatever. The capital, which in itself rests on a social mode of production and presupposes a social concentration of means of production and labor power, is here directly endowed with the form of social capital of directly associated individuals, as distinct from private capital, and its undertakings assume the form of social undertakings as distinct from private undertakings. It is the abolition of capital as private property within the framework of capitalist production itself. It refers to joint stock companies. It refers to this. So he's saying joint stock companies are the abolition of capital as private property within the framework of capitalist production himself. What? What could he possibly mean by this? What he means by this is when we have the owner-operator firm, the company is kind of like the private property of the owner-operator. He controls all this kind of stuff and whatever. When we have the joint stock company, you could have, theoretically, millions of shareholders who are collectively owning this company, right? We have that right now. If you go look at how many people own the stock of Microsoft or own the stock of General Motors or whatever, it's millions and millions of people, right? It's not just one guy, this is my private property, my company. It's millions of people who are, as he says right here, engaged in a kind of social undertaking as distinct from private undertaking, right? At the point at which you've got millions of people owning a company together, that's a kind of social collective ownership that's very distinct from a private ownership of an owner-operator. Right? And the joint stock company is what allows us to glimpse this. It's what allows us to see this possibility for the very first time, right? A form of social capital, a form of capital that is of directly associated individuals, the shareholders as a class owning it, not one dude, this is my personal company, okay? And we'll do one more here before we move on. In stock companies, the function is divorced from capital ownership. Hence, also labor is an entirely divorced from ownership of means of production and surplus labor. This result of the ultimate development of capitalist production is a necessary transitional phase towards the reconversion of capital into the property of producers, although no longer as the private property of individual producers, but rather as the property of associated producers as outright social property. So the joint stock company, he's saying, look at this structure. It allows us to have a company that is jointly owned, right? It allows us, we could take this structure, tweak it a little bit, and we could have collective ownership with this structure. We could make it to where the company was just owned by workers or society more general, as he says here, as the property of producers, but not as their private property, not as their individual property, but rather as collective property, as property of associated producers, right? Meaning they will collectively own the firms as shareholders, as opposed to, well, everyone gets their own business and this is my private thing. And, I guess you have an individual property right in your specific share, if you want to think about that way. But the company is being owned jointly. And this only becomes possible because we have the joint stock company. He's so fucking excited. I'm excited too. I'm excited too because I see what he sees. This is exploitable. You could exploit this to get into socialism. And on the other hand, the stock company is a transition towards the conversion of all functions in the reproduction process. Blah, blah. All right. Anyways. All right. Key. The joint stock company. So let's move on to the next one, okay? Because everything now is just going to be a variation on this. Because like I've just explained, this is the thing where you can start doing collective ownership. You couldn't do it before, with the owner-operated stuff. This is the thing that can do it. Okay, so before I start getting into collective ownership or kind of like quasi-collective ownership, let me start with one, before I get into the socialist forms that I think, yeah, we should call that socialist. Let me start with this one, just to kind of show you the flexibility of this structure and what you can do. If you start from the joint stock company structure and then you start goofing around with it, what kind of things you can accomplish. A nonprofit organization, all right? So you probably hear, nonprofits. Well, how do nonprofits work? What nonprofits do, let's delete the arrow, is they get rid of the shareholder, but they keep this. So when you form a nonprofit, usually the way it goes is the person that forms the nonprofit, they file incorporation documents in the state, and they say, I want to file a nonprofit organization. As part of forming that organization, there are rules. They have to create bylaws. The bylaws require the organization to look a certain way, and one of the things the bylaws requires you to do is to have a board. So you say, okay, I'm going to have a nonprofit organization, which means that we're going to have a board. And so the person who starts the organization, they essentially appoint the first board. So let's imagine you have a board of 9 people. They go out, they find friends, whatever. They appoint the first board. And they do that while they're incorporating their nonprofit. They go, oh, these are the 9 people that are going to be on my board. I checked all the boxes. Please, state corporation's office, please approve my company and let me, have it, right? So they appoint the first board, right? There are no shareholders, no equity. That's part of being a nonprofit and getting that status. And there's no shareholders. There's no equity. But you have a board. So now the question is, well, then how the hell does the board get picked? We know how the first board gets picked, but obviously the first 9 people on the board are not going to be on the board forever. If nothing else, people die. Well, the way these are usually structured is the board replaces itself. So in the prior structure, the shareholders elect the board, and then the board controls the executive, right? That's how the power flows. Here, the board elects the board. So whenever someone leaves the board, you would say you have a 9-seat board. 2 people leave, let's say, and now you have a 7-person board. Well, those 7 people will go out and find 2 more board members, and usually, by majority vote, they'll appoint those 2 board members. Usually these things are pretty collegial, so you'll get a unanimous vote. All 7 of the board members will find two new board members and say, we want them on board, and they'll bring them onto the board. The board members also have the ability to expel the other board members, because remember, in the joint stock form, the shareholders have that power, right? Periodically, depending on the bylaws, there are board elections, and they could oust the board and put in new people. If they think the board's not doing a good job, they want to see the company go in a different direction, they can do that. Here, the board ousts itself in a strange way, and usually the ways these are written, the only way you can oust a board member is with the unanimous consent of all the other board members. So, if someone is really, really doing some crazy shit, the other 8 board members will vote to kick them out, and then they'll replace them with someone else. But that's how the board regenerates itself, is the board becomes the shareholders and the board simultaneously. It takes that role, but there's no equity. I would not call this a socialist organization because there is no collective ownership of this entity. The board, you have essentially to the extent that you want to think of the boards as being at least the controlling owners, even if not the beneficial owners, because there's no profit and they don't get the profit, no profit is paid out to them. There's no dividend or anything like that. To the extent that you want to think of them as the controlling owners, because not only are they the board, but they also elect the board. They're like a self-selecting permanent thing. There's no, society doesn't get to say who's on the board. The workers and the nonprofit don't get to say who's on the board. So I wouldn't call this socialistic, but notice it is a derivation from the joint stock company. It's just them saying, what if we swapped out the shareholders with no shareholders and had a board that is self-perpetuating and self-selecting? Now we have an entity that functions. And these nonprofit organizations, when it comes to financing, they can get loans. Oftentimes they get philanthropic capital, donations, stuff like that, brings money into it. And you can either think of those as consumers, like donors to a nonprofit as like consumers, as their customers, or you could, I guess, think of them as financiers, but just financiers who get no ownership stake or any return, but they just like the nonprofit. Anyways. All right, so we got the nonprofit. Now let's go to the first type of organization that maybe is socialist. I don't know. Let's see what we think about this one. The consumer co-op. Huh? There we go. Now we're talking. Okay, so how does the consumer co-op work? Here's how we're going to do this. Okay? So remember, in the joint stock company, up here, we have the shareholders, right? So you see the shareholders over here. They were sitting up here, and they elected the board, and they received the profits from the co-op. With the consumer co-op, we take that joint stock company structure, we kick out the shareholders, and then we make the consumers the shareholders, right? So the consumers, the customers of the company, just replace the shareholders. Those consumers appoint the board. So there are elections and stuff like that that the consumers get to vote on. And to the extent that the co-op has profits, those are also distributed to the consumer. Different co-ops distribute them differently. I would say a very common way of doing it is to basically give people store credit at the end of the year. So the co-op will say, hey, we had a profit this year of, X amount of dollars. And so we're going to kick that back to the consumers. So what we're going to do is for every $100 you spent at our store last year, we're going to give you $5 of store credit for next year, right? And so the people who spend more. And so it's kind of like we're kicking back the profit, right? Because if you spend $100, we're basically suggesting that 5 of those $100 was just profit to us. But you're also the owner of the co-op, so we're going to kick that back to you. And the easiest way to do that is in the form of store credit, because then it's all easy to manage. But some of them do just pay cash dividends out to consumers as well, like a cash back kind of thing. But yeah, so here's the consumer co-op. It's the joint stock company, but now the consumers are also the shareholders. What are some examples of this? In the U.S., we have REI, which is the outdoors, you can buy camping gear and stuff like that. It is, according to them, and I think this is true, it is the nation's largest consumer co-op. With that said, there's been a lot of controversy about how REI's bylaws have changed in recent years. Not worth going too much into that here, but there are many people who make, I think, a very persuasive argument that at one time in the past, REI was a much more kind of legitimate consumer co-op in the sense that the members, I'm a member of REI because I buy stuff there from sometimes you pay like $30 and then they give you a $30 gift card and you become a member of REI and you remain an active member of REI who has nominal voting rights in the co-op. You retain that as long as you spend $10 a year at the company, which I typically do to go get like winter gloves and stuff like that. So there are, I think, millions of people who are members of this co-op who have voting rights in it. But when you vote for the board of directors these days, they have this nominating committee that kind of is like a closed loop, is how the critics suggested. So back in the day, any member could run as a board of director. They could like petition to do it and I guess get signatures and stuff like that. So there was like a real kind of democratic process where anyone could kind of run for it. Now you only get to vote on boards on directors that the nominating committee has put together, but the nominating committee is also, I think, often made up of the board of directors. So it starts looking like that nonprofit structure we saw before, where this is the little line back here is being cut off and the board is just replacing itself each year. And a lot of people are pissed off about that. I guess I am too. I don't know. I just go there to buy stuff. But But yeah, that's in the US. Now, there's another example of this that I think is far more interesting. And I think we're going to do a paper about this company at People's Policy Project at one point. It's called S Group. It's in Finland, of course. And S Group is the largest non-governmental employer in Finland. It's a massive, massive, sprawling coalition of consumer co-ops, not worker co-ops, consumer co-ops, right? The consumer is the shareholder, right? And I mean, what it runs, Finland is a nation of 5.5 million people, so just keep that in perspective. It runs, I think, the largest grocery store chain in the country, 900 outlets, and it's got other stores as well. Yeah, here we go. S-Market is Finland's largest grocery store chain. It's run by the consumer co-op. So imagine, what is the largest grocery store chain in the U.S.? It's either Kroger or Walmart now. So imagine if Kroger or Walmart was a consumer co-op. But imagine if it wasn't just Kroger and Walmart. Imagine if also one of, if not the largest department store, which I don't know, what is that, Macy's or something, is also the consumer co-op called S Group. And let's go forward. What if one of, if not the largest hardware store, Home Depot, was part of the consumer co-op? And let's go even forward. What if the largest gas station chain was part of the consumer co-op? And what if actually the hotels and the restaurants were part of the consumer co-op? Like the largest chains of those. I don't know if they're the largest, but they're certainly close to it. And then what if the co-op also had a bank with 3.1 million customers? Remember, this is a country with 5.5 million people in it. What if it also ran one of the largest, I guess, the largest consumer-facing bank in your country? All of these things are inside this one consumer co-op. It's wild. It's the largest employer in all of Finland. And they have some interesting stats on it here. The customer is the owner, right? I put consumer, but customer, yeah. Cooperative activities are particularly profitable for the co-op members. In such operations, attention is paid not only to financial profitability, but also social responsibility, blah, blah, blah. Our operations continue to be based on the traditional cooperative principles, such as open membership, democracy, and equality, as well as bonuses for co-op members and the distribution of the surplus, like I was just talking about before. With us, the customer is the owner. You become the co-op member by paying a membership fee. So anyone can become a member of this co-op. You pay the fee. Similar to REI, you pay your $30. One vote, one share, equal shares of control. The benefits for the owners, discounts, etc. Benefits for everyone. So here's some interesting figures. They have nearly 2.5 million members of this co-op. Finland is a 5.5 million person country, and I think at least like 1.2 million of those are children who would not be eligible for membership because they're not old enough. So it's like pretty much, I mean, it's the majority of the people who could be a member of this co-op, like adults in Finland, are members of the co-op. These are the bonus paid, which is their way of describing the surplus. They paid 379 million. These are all the money that got kicked back to the consumer because the consumer is the owner. So when the co-op profits, it gets kicked back to the consumer in one way or another. This is cool. As a co-op member, you're entitled to vote in the cooperative elections. These elections are held every 4 years to elect a council of representatives to safeguard the co-op members' interests. Everyone is entitled to vote. And here's the thing that makes it different from REI. If you have turned 18 and live in the area of your regional cooperative, you can also run for membership in the Council of Representatives. So anyone could run to be in the governing board, basically, which they call the Council of Representatives. Not so for REI. So it's like a legit co-op. And it's giant. And one of the reasons why I'm interested in writing I'm not going to write the piece, but having someone write a paper at PPP about it is this socialism? I mean, normally I would say consumer co-ops don't go far enough, because it's not the workers at all these massive amounts of businesses here. It's not the workers that own the company. It's the consumers. But the consumers are like everyone in the country. So at that point, that's basically like full-blown social ownership. So I would say this one has got to be a socialist entity, right? It's social ownership. It's just done through a consumer co-op mode. But I mean, at this scale, this is full-blown virtually society-wide ownership, collective ownership. They all get, I mean, it's one member, one vote, right? So it's not like other kind of companies where you get more votes depending on the amount of shares that you own. The shares are equal. So one person, one vote. All you got to do is pay a small fee to be a member. Everyone can run for the board, and like the vast majority of the adults in the country are members of the co-op. That to me is a socialist institution. REI maybe less so. But yeah, so there's the consumer co-op. That's fun. Now let's go into the worker co-op. So this is the first kind of like full-blown socialist structure, I would say. And all we do with the worker co-op is we take our little curved line here and we bring it here. It's a little ugly, but you get the point, right? Remember before we had the shareholders up here and they elected the board and they were the owners and they received the profits and all that. Then with the consumer co-op, we just took the shareholder out and we put the consumer in. And then with the worker co-op, we take the shareholder out and we put the worker in, right? So the workers now become the shareholders. They elect the board, they get the profits, et cetera, et cetera. One example of this in the US is these evergreen cooperatives. This website is not super useful in the same way as the S Group one is, and like really giving you some cool stuff that I could show you about the co-ops. But the way these co-ops are structured is there's like a nonprofit at the center, and then there are these co-ops. There used to be 3, now there's only 2. One of them is like an energy company that I think basically installs solar, and then the other one is a laundry company that does basically like mass industrial laundry for hospitals and educational institutions and stuff like that. Anyways, the workers own the entity in a kind of in a way. I mean, they do. I don't know the exact details of it. It's a little bit of an interesting mix of things they've got going on here, but put them aside because that's not really the point. The point here is this is the structure, right? Is the workers own. And I would say, yes, this seems like a socialist institution. Is Marx, the thing we just read from Marx where he's creaming himself about the joint stock company, this is what he's excited about. He's excited about this, about how you can just knock the shareholder out and put the worker where the shareholder is, and you're good to go. Like normally you would say, oh, well, the workers can't run the business because this and that. The shareholders also do not run the business. That was the beauty of the joint stock company. The ownership is now completely separated from day-to-day management, so anyone realistically could be the owner, including the worker in the firm itself. Because those owners can elect a competent board that would put in place a competent leader. That leader is subject to the will of the workers, because the workers can always replace the board and replace the executive if they're not happy. But you could just swap the shareholder out for the worker. Now you have a worker co-op. That's a socialist institution. And if you don't think it's a socialist institution, ask yourself this question. What if all the companies were organized like this in your whole economy? Would you really continue to call that a capitalist economy? No. Right? And if you would, I don't know, then we're just arguing semantics. This is a socialist institution, okay? So we got that. Now what comes next? Now, as many people who follow me for a long time will know, I'm fine with worker co-ops. It's not really my big game, okay? So let's start moving into the good shit. State-owned enterprises. Now, we're going to take that joint stock company form. Remember, the shareholders, I'm going to bring them in just to kind of remind you what the joint stock company looked like. Remember, this is what the joint stock company looked like. Right? And as Marx points out, this is an unbelievably exploitable structure. We can take this and start doing socialism with it. Whoops. So let's start doing that. Let's get the shareholders kicked out of here. Before we kick them out, and the nonprofit just put in place a self-perpetuating board. The consumer co-op replaced the shareholders with the consumer. The worker co-op replaced the shareholders with the worker. And now the state-owned enterprise is going to replace the shareholder with the government. And if it is a democratic society, of course, the shareholder, I'm going to squeeze this in here. If it's a democratic society, the voters are above the government, right? Because the voters appoint the government in elections. Okay. So now the chain of power works like this. And what are some examples of this? This is how the Postal Service works, right? We elect the president and we elect the Senate, here, the government. The government then appoints the board members of the U.S. Postal Service and also may appoint the CEO directly. I'm not sure. Sometimes the government will appoint a board and then the board will manage the CEO election, which is common in like the joint stock company form. Sometimes the government, you may not even have a board, depending on the state-owned enterprise. The government might just directly appoint executives. Or sometimes they might appoint both. They might have a board that they want to appoint, and then they might also separately appoint the executives. But one way or another, this is how things flow. We knocked out the shareholders, and we replaced them really with the voters. But the voters are acting through the government that they elect, right? Again, I think this is a socialist structure. I would say an enterprise that is organized this way, like the U.S. Postal Service, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, like Amtrak, like most like municipal utility companies. I would say that's a socialist entity, right? Because we no longer have these external shareholders where rich capitalists are appointing the board that appoint the executives, and the profits are flowing out to these rich capitalists, and the amount of control you have depends on how much money how many shares you own, right? If you own 10% of the shares, you get 10% of the votes. No. One voter, one man, one vote, one person, one vote, one woman, one vote, whatever. One person, one vote, elects the government. They put in place the board. The board gives you the executives, and the executives have the workers, and they deliver for the consumers. The board can be, if the board starts doing shit the government doesn't like, the board can get kicked out. We saw this, or in most cases, the government will just go to the board and say, hey, and to the executive and be like, hey, we can kick you out, right? Okay, so we don't really want you doing that right now. So a good example of this during the Trump administration was the Tennessee Valley Authority. If you're unfamiliar with that, that's basically a big electric company that operates in Tennessee. It's owned fully by the federal government. It's one of the largest electric companies in the entire United States. I think it serves something like 12 million people in that area. Anyways, they were going to outsource some of their IT work offshore to another country, and of course Trump was very much like, keep our jobs at home. That's part of his whole shtick. And so he came down on them quite hard and was saying, hey, no. The TVA is a federal state-owned enterprise. We control it. I appoint the board. I appoint the CEO. I could get rid of you if I wanted to get rid of you. This decision is one you need to reverse. Bring the jobs back, not bring the jobs back because they hadn't sent them over. But if, at this point they were announcing that they were going to do this, the unions were complaining and saying, hey, we don't want these workers laid off. These are important American jobs, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And whatever you think of that decision, pro or con, what we saw there was ultimately it was the government appointed by the voters that got to come in and say, no, we don't like that decision, reverse it. That would not be something you could do if Walmart was making that decision. That would not be something you could do if Microsoft was making that decision. Why? Because those are joint stock companies. And because you have the shareholders instead of the voters and the government here, right? Another example of this that where we can actually kind of almost sort of take the government out, or at least there's a very like explicit way that this works, is think about school districts. School districts are little companies, big companies actually in a lot of cases. Sometimes they are like almost separate governments. Sometimes they are nestled inside a municipal government. They're structured a little bit differently depending on where you are in the country. But the predominant way that these work is you have a board, literally called a school board. The board is elected by the voters in the area. That board appoints executives, usually called the superintendent. That superintendent runs from there. They get principals, hire teachers, and whatever, and then the consumers are the students. So here, look, we kicked out the shareholders. In a joint stock company, the shareholders elect the board. In this state-owned enterprise, or you might also call it a general government service, depending on your preferred nomenclature, in this state-owned enterprise, it's the voters who are voting on a one-person, one-vote basis, not shareholders. And of course, in the case of public schools, they don't generate a profit. There's no profit to be kicked out. In the case of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, where I was talking about before, they do generate a profit, and that profit is set aside for economic development in the Tennessee Valley area. So all the profit is spent essentially on like various, I don't know, it's like a combination of like philanthropic and like business development purposes in the area, not paid out to a shareholder. So to me, that's a socialist enterprise, just as the worker co-op is a socialist enterprise. The consumer co-op in Finland, yes, I would say that one is. REI, I would not go that far. Okay, one more example. Not one more example, one more form here. And I'm going to call this one funds socialism. Okay. So the way a fund socialism works is first things first, we're going to replace. Why did I take the voters out? Yeah. We'll put the voters over here for the moment. Okay. I should probably bring all this stuff down. Can I like move it? Oh, look at that. Look at that on the fly. I'm such a power user. Okay. So we're going to bring a fund in here. Okay. What kind of fund, Matt? I don't know. We'll get to it. I'm going to bring a fund in here. What am I doing? Why didn't I get an arrow? Oh, I got to like select the specific arrow, right? We're going to bring a fund in here. Okay. So now we've swapped out the shareholders with a fund. And this could be a pension fund. It could be a social wealth fund, which is a fund organized by a government like we see with the Alaska Permanent Fund or Norway's sovereign wealth fund. It could be a worker fund, a union fund, whatever, right? But you kind of use the fund as this sort of intermediary institution. Now they're the ones that are voting as shareholders. They take the place of the shareholder. So when shareholders vote on the board, the fund and their employees, they sit down and they vote on the board, right? If there are shareholder resolutions, the fund votes the shares, right? There's someone in the fund. They have a process for deciding how they're going to vote the shares, okay? And there's a couple ways to do this. So some of you may be familiar with the Meidner plan. The Meidner plan, this is going to get very convoluted. I'm going to do my best. I can move this over, right? So let's see if I bump this over here. That might give me a little bit more space. Okay. Perfect. Yes. Okay. These guys need to go over here. All right, the Meidner plan was a plan in mid-century Sweden that their trade unions, they were going to go full-blown socialist and bring ownership of the companies into worker ownership. And the way they wanted to do this was through sector unions. So in Sweden, each sector, there's a union that represents the workers in that sector. So all the companies, there might be 20 companies in a sector, all the workers and all the firms in that sector belong to the same union. So their hotshot idea was to say, okay, why don't we have each sector union create a new fund, and that fund will buy up all of the shares over time, and we'll use taxes and other kind of mechanisms to make this possible. We don't need to go into the specifics there. Why does it want to go that way? I want it to go this way. What if let's just put it there. Boom. All right. Over time, the union will, the union's sector fund will buy up all the shares and will own all the companies in that sector. So now the power flows this way. The workers are members of the union. The union is just an aggregation of these members, right? And they get to control the union in like a one person, one vote way. They elect union leadership and all that kind of stuff. So the workers belong to the union as members of the union. The union then has this fund. The fund is basically taking the place of the shareholders. The fund owns all the shares of all the, or maybe just the majority of the shares, whatever. It owns controlling stakes of all of the companies in the sector that the union represents. And so now through that process, it appoints the board. Any profits that the companies make in each sector will go up to the fund, which of course will go up to the union. The union could then decide things to do with it. It could kick it out to the workers. They were actually giving out surveys at their big like union conferences where people could select, like, what do you think we should do with the money once we own all the companies through these union sector funds? It was quite a thrilling time. It feels like when I read about it, but yeah, so that would be this structure. This is the Meidner plan. Let me put it up here. Meidner plan. Now notice, this all is just a riff off the joint stock company. You could see again why Marx was so excited about this, because all we did is we took shareholders and we replaced it with a union and a sector fund. And then, of course, the workers control the union. Now the workers control not just the company that they work for, because in a co-op, the workers only own the company that they work for. In this case, they're going to own all the companies in the whole sector, right? But by basically just riffing off of the joint stock company, replacing the shareholders with the union and a fund, and then having the workers be members of the union, now you've achieved collective worker ownership of the entire sector. Each worker would own, some fractional share of all the companies in the sector they work in. That is socialistic. That is socialistic. Surely that's socialistic, isn't it? So that's one way to do fund socialism. And then we have this other way of doing it. Here, I'll just delete union here. And now we have government. And then, of course, we're going to bring back the voters. This is roughly, this is what the Alaska Permanent Fund looks like. And this is what the Norwegian sovereign wealth funds look like. And there are like dozens of sovereign wealth funds across the world. You even have them in some other states. North Dakota has one, right? So the voters elect the government. The government has established a fund. And then the fund owns all these companies. And as owner, it does have some power. Now, the funds that exist right now, they don't own enough to exert too much power, but again, let's think about structures and what structures allow us to do. Let's think about Marx and be excited about this in the same way that he's excited about the joint stock company. Because what's exciting about this is you could take this idea of a social wealth fund and you could really blow it up as far as big as you want, right? And in the Alaska Permanent Fund case, what happens is the voters elect the government. The government runs the Alaska Permanent Fund. The Alaska Permanent Fund owns all these shares of all these companies, which they do vote. So they do vote on board elections. They're not the only owners in the companies that they, but okay, it's fractional ownership, but it's a jumping off point where we could go further. And then when these companies profit, when they put off returns in one form or another, those returns come out of the company, up to the fund, up through the government, and they literally pay it out as a universal dividend to everyone in Alaska, right? On a one person, one dividend basis. Everyone gets the exact same dividend. That's different from the shareholder structure. right? Where it's instead of voters and the government and a fund, it's just the shareholders, and the shareholders, they get return that is in proportion to what percent of the company they own, which effectively means they get return in proportion to their overall level of wealth. How much of the economy they own, that's how much of the share of the profit share that they get out of the economy. Here, it's not like that. Everyone gets an equal profit share out of this fund, right? So you could see again, what did they just do? I mean, through this process, we've just taken the joint stock company structure and we've tweaked around a little bit. And now we have what Marx was so excited about, which was we can now have collective ownership. We could have endlessly fractional ownership where everyone is involved. Everyone, gets one person, one vote, right? In Alaska, everyone gets to vote on the government, one person, one vote, and they each get the same dividends back. We did it, at least when it comes to collective ownership. Now, as I started off this whole thing saying, just because you have a social wealth fund or have a co-op or have some state-owned enterprises, I'm not going to tell you that doesn't, necessarily tell you, well, that's a socialist country or that's a socialist economy, because economies have some units that are organized this way and some units that are organized other way. The goal of a socialist, in my mind, at least if you're kind of a practical policy-minded socialist, is to try to move as much as the economy as you can, more of the economy from where we are now, into these forms, into the form of the worker co-op perhaps, or the state-owned enterprise, or the social wealth fund, or hell, even that consumer co-op. That's at least an improvement. I don't know if you're going to call that socialism per se. In Finland I would, in REI I wouldn't, but is to take these basically tweaks on the joint stock company form that replaces the capitalist shareholder with other kinds of structures, whether it's the worker or the consumer or voters operating through the government, right, is to replace the capitalist shareholder with these other entities. And that's something that we can do because the joint stock company has made it to where the owner and the manager are completely separate things, right? So, yeah, that's socialism to me in a nutshell, right? And I get, look, as Richard Wolff would say, there's a lot of different socialists that have existed in this world. Some of them were more concerned with other things. But if you want to talk about collective ownership of the means of production, which to me, that is the thing that unites socialism, this is how you should start thinking about it in practical terms, right? Pretty much and even the countries that we would call socialist, whether pejoratively or not, whether you like them or not, their ownership structures all took one of these forms, right? Yugoslavia under Tito, he did the worker co-op stuff, which we talked about earlier. The Soviet Union, those were state-owned enterprises. Just like the Postal Service, just like the TVA, just like those were state-owned enterprises. They just had a lot of state-owned enterprises. China right now, if you think China is China has that, their thing is state-owned enterprises. That's a big part of their doing. They also have huge social wealth funds in China. So these are the structures we've actually seen that are meant to collectivize wealth. They're all riffs on the joint stock company, and for good reason. Marx saw it before anyone else did, perhaps. No, he actually isn't the first person who saw it. If you listen to my socialism series on the Patreon podcast, patreon.com/thebrunigs, I walked through other people who actually saw this before Marx, who saw this structure of the company, of a joint stock company, and saw what you could do with it to basically just, it's a one short step from there to socialism. And yeah. So yeah, I don't know how convincing this is to anyone. Obviously, you can go find someone else who'll tell you something else. And I think usually when you present it this way, it's just, I think people get turned off by it because it seems a little bit bloodless, right? I mean, what have I just done? I've told you, I've walked you through corporate governance, and it's like, that's it. That's socialism. It's corporate governance reform on some fundamental level. But isn't it a movement of romantics and revolution? And it's like, it is and it isn't. It just depends on which socialists you're interested in. But in the canon of wonk socialists, which Marx certainly was, in the canon of the people who are thinking about how are we going to do this, And then in the countries that have actually sort of done it, this is what we've been talking about. This is what we've really seen. So, and I think it's legit. So, anyway, sound off in the comments. Let me know. Tell me I'm wrong, or tell me that this just clarified everything you've ever thought. I don't know. Give me some feedback. Like, subscribe, tell your friends, etc., etc. See you later.